So I would like to welcome Tsitsi so much and applaud your courage that you're doing this in the dark, because you will see that it is actually not putting on her camera. And those of you who were already in the little chat before will know that that is because she is sitting in a power cut South Africa right now. So she has a battery and that is it. So we're trying to save it. And if electricity all of a sudden come up, then she will appear like Houdini. So we will see, we will see. We're so happy to have you here because we really think it's so important to get impressions and experiences from all over the world. And when we speak about sustainability, we speak about sustainable investing, we have to realize that it changes from region to region and the reality on the ground is different from region to region. So it's really, really such a pleasure to have you here to share your experience with us. And without further ado, I'm going to hand you the floor. And as always, tell everybody who is here to just ask questions, raise their hands, and have an interactive discussion. And if you have no questions, then I will call you out and just put you on the spot. Go ahead.
Okay, let me share a little bit about myself. So I am a third generation family business owner, and I was born and have lived in the continent most of my life. I've had some experience in living in America as well as in the UK, particularly New York, Sheffield, Newcastle, and now South Africa. I've got Africa in my blood apparently. And I work with family businesses, especially around trying to grow multi-generational wealth and making their businesses more viable to become multi-generational businesses. And so in this conversation, which Christina was so kind to bring me in, I'm talking about ESG from an African perspective and governance challenges in the South African region. And I think a lot of the things that I'll talk about, although Africa is not a homogeneous group, we have a lot of things that are common across the board, no matter where you go on the continent, power cuts being at the top of the list. And so because of some of these commonalities, you find I co-founded an organization called African Family Firms with my partner, Nike Anani, and she sits in Lagos, but she's currently moving to Austin, Dallas, and Austin, Texas. So you find that this is another thing you find happening a lot on the continent, a lot of movement from country to country, sometimes relocation because of just the discomfort of some of the things that happen on the continent. And so when you're looking from an ESG perspective, where does Africa stand and what are the activities that are being done with relation to ESG? Firstly, I think as much as I would like to say that Africa is aware of, let's just deal with the environmental issues, climate change and everything around it. It's an elitist conversation to the majority of Africans. When you're talking of ESG, environmental, especially social, because of governance and then governance itself, you find that there's a lot of disconnect in some of these conversations because the majority of Africans may have a lot of access to cell phones. We are the only continent with the biggest number of cell phones, smartphones on the globe. However, we don't use these smartphones the way they're used in the West. We don't look at environmental and climate issues in the way that it's done in the West. In some countries, they will speak about it, like in South Africa in particular, because South Africa really wants to align itself as being a global citizen. However, you find that there's a lot of conversations that are not happening when you want to reach into the grassroots where the real conversations need to be happening. How can you address climate change and make it impactful in your rural communities, because that is where the majority of African citizens are. They're still very much in their rural communities. And then you also have a lot of countries on the continent that go through the governance issues where governance as we know it from a democratic perspective is not the common conversation on the continent. And I think right now, there's so many countries that are going through the shakings of what is democracy, what is not democracy, and the control freak behavior that happens with some of our leaders. I know right now, the reason why my partner is moving from Lagos to Austin is simply because Nigeria itself is on the brink of a civil war. Yet it is, I think, it's the second biggest economy on the continent. And if that economy breaks down, it's going to impact the rest of the continent. Why is this happening? It's because of governance. It all started when a tweet was deleted by Twitter, and the president wouldn't have it, so he decided to throw a fit. And there were already other underlying issues that were already happening in their country. And this is not something new on the continent. It's not something to say, oh my goodness, why is this happening? This happens consistently on the continent because of some of the issues that we have been carrying from post, no, I would say during colonialism. Some of the borders that are on the continent were not created, well, all of the borders were not created by Africans. They were created during the colonial era, and they had no thought about the traditional tribal or cultural issues that would come into play. We've had a lot of unrest on the continent and inability to govern ourselves because our conversations have never been about what really is democracy and what is the conversation around democracy, but we're still inheriting that after effect of colonialism where we want to be in power, but we do not understand what that responsibility means to the citizens of a country. And then we have those tribal issues because some of the borders that were created in created countries were closed in traditional or historic tribal enemies. And no matter what you say to people and you say to them, let's rethink and have a different conversation, it's hard to build on animosity that has never been addressed. It's hard to build on animosity that has never been taken into consideration, that maybe let's rethink some of these borders and recreate maybe an open Africa, or an Africa that is demarcated by the tribal conversation, because that's been one of the biggest pushbacks. And when you're thinking about then bringing in businesses into creating spaces, or governments into creating spaces where everybody benefits from a societal conversation, that is very hard to make happen because some members of the government might not be in the same tribe as other people who are in the country. And you find that they start segregating, they start treating people inhumanely. And I think we've all had the conversations. And I think even in the bigger countries like South Africa, which really pushed the whole Rainbow Nation conversation when Nelson Mandela was alive, and still trying to push that, there's still that outbreak of xenophobia that happens because there's that fear of what are the other Africans coming into my country going to bring with them? And within the borders of South Africa themselves, you find that there's a tribal conflict that happens. It becomes very difficult even for investors to want to put money into spaces where there is uncertainty. And it's very difficult for investors to think of, will they be able to get their money out once they put investments in those spaces? I can tell you from my experience as a business owner in Zimbabwe, particularly, South Africa has been very good at trying to toe the line in terms of creating financial security around investments. But then in other countries like Zimbabwe, for example, we had a stage where, and it's still an ongoing conversation, because in the last 3 weeks, they implemented a new statute where they pretty much are playing around with the currencies again. And the example I wanted to give is, we went 100% into US dollars. We were using US dollars as a chosen currency to try to stabilize our economy. And then as this was happening, a few years down the line, the economy seemed to have stabilized because it had a stable currency that was holding it up. Some governance issues happened, and within a 24-hour period, people could no longer access their money from the banks. The Reserve Bank no longer had any money at all, so you could not access your money. And then we were told, a government announcement told us that they were now printing what they called the bond note, and that was equivalent to the US dollar. So this is 1:1. And so all of a sudden, you couldn't access US dollars, but you could access this bond note. And the black market revived itself. And it was obvious that that bond note was going to leap and crash. And so when you're thinking foremost, a lot of these companies, a lot of people who went through this trauma were not thinking about how to create better societal change, how to protect the environment, how to look at good governance. They were looking at survival issues. And that is a common thread you find across the continent, where most companies, most people are looking at survival issues. And so it looks like then we neglect the importance of ESG and how it can change the continent. It's because I think there's not enough awareness and enough alignment with the players that can create policies that will be favorable for ESG, as well as making it a priority for business owners and them seeing how impactful it will be positively on the society and the communities around them. And I believe that it's a very important conversation that needs to happen, because Africa, being the last continent with available resources, mineral resources, land resources, as well as going to have the youngest population. So it's going to have the youngest HR. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to create awareness. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to possibly in the future make Africa an example of how ESG can be done right. And it can be done from a place where it looked hopeless, because right now it's the only place that doesn't have the extreme industrial revolution that has created that vacuum that now needs us to start being aware and being intentional. I think I'm done.
I think that you are on a roll and not done at all. Thank you so much for all these super valuable inputs. I have like a million comments and questions, but I'm going to just open the floor and ask if somebody wants to go before me. Can also be in the chat, obviously. Anybody? Well, I, for one, absolutely, I can't say I love, but I think it's absolutely fascinating the link you're making between the governance and the broader governance issues, and also the fact that we cannot expect that people coming from abject poverty in some cases can actually really even sometimes contemplate these things, and that it has to be a multifaceted approach that takes into consideration both private wealth as well as government and local authority and how things are actually governed at that level. I don't know if you can perhaps speak a little bit to multi-stakeholder engagement and how much is there of the engagement between, whenever that is possible, the private wealth owners and the government level or the local authority level, and do you see it mostly positive, or is it sometimes more of an obstacle?
I think when you have multiple parties engaging each other, you have a bit of accountability that's there. And that goes a long way. Accountability makes the person who's making a decision aware that their decision is something that is being watched and something that people are going to make them accountable for. But to be honest, it's in the private sector, it's something that can be implemented, and successfully so, if you get the right partners together and they've got the right project and they all feel passionately towards making it work. My experience with governments is that any project that they become a stakeholder in, initially, if it's driven by private, it will go well, but they're always looking for political leveraging. And I think that's a global thing, to be quite honest. Everyone's looking for political leveraging, but it becomes a bit stringent when you do not toe the line that they want you to toe or put the message out that they want you to put out. They can then all of a sudden put in place laws or regulations or dust up books with laws and regulations that say you cannot do this. I'll give you a fine example, which is quite interesting. So the three most important areas that need to really have development on the continent going forward have got to be education, because we're going to have the youngest population. We do currently have the youngest population. That means this is where your skill set is going to come from. So any work and any development that's going to happen, this is the human capital. And investing in education means that you are creating sustainable income. You're creating ability to innovate. You're creating ability to become part of a global community, a global workforce. That's only if the education is gotten right. Right now, when you look at the education system across the continent, it's quite different. And the markers of the education system are dependent on which country colonized the African country. Even if you look at the legal system, it is all based on common law, because most countries were colonized by the British. So with your education, you find that initially the education was brought in by missionaries who wanted the Africans to read and be able to share more about the Bible and so forth. And then the colonialists realized that this would be a good idea because they needed administrators, right? But then when independence came to most of these countries, those education systems did not change. But the world has been changing, and colonialism happened like 50 odd years ago now. And we cannot live in that space where we're saying we cannot be accountable to these young children. They are our future. They are the people who are going to be pushing forward that agenda around let's be environmentally aware, let us be socially aware, as well as let us look at governance, right? Currently, most of the education systems in Africa have failed. They are leaning on an archaic system. They're not developing. And because of that, we have a young population, which probably half of, and you're looking at about, it will be 2 billion people on the continent, half of that will not be educated or will have the basic education. How is that going to be sustainable? How is that going to help in terms of increasing awareness on ESG issues? How is that going to help in terms of creating jobs for them? What are you going to be able to create skilled jobs for them or not? And then the next tier you need to look at on the continent is healthcare. Healthcare is heavily impacted on the continent. Your maternal mortality rate is appalling. Things that would normally not kill people in the more advanced world are killing people on the continent. That's inclusive of the most basic necessities of healthcare. We are lacking that on the continent. Yet we have a lot of qualified healthcare people who are leaving and getting more qualifications as they get out of the country and getting offered jobs off continent. So we're losing the critical skills that were there already, and we're not training more. The third thing that is key to the development of the continent is food security. We have vast arable land on the continent. People are looking to us to produce food for the world in the next few decades. Are we going to be able to do that when a lot of the poster child that you get for Africa is hunger? How are we teaching or creating atmospheres or collaborations that allow us to start producing food, not only for ourselves, but for the globe? And not only use, we've seen what GMOs and how unsustainable practices in agriculture have destroyed other continents. How are we going to teach the people on the ground here to produce food in ways that is not destructive to the environment and which will not completely eradicate and destroy whatever land we have left? And by all means, I don't think that Perseverance has yet found arable land in Mars. So right now, our last chance is definitely the continent. And so getting people to work in these three spaces can be very difficult, and getting them to be aware, because when you say education to African governments, they're thinking you are trying to teach people democracy. So they're not really willing to put the work in education because they feel as if you're going to teach them something that will take away their power. So it's that wanting to keep minions mentality. There's no forethought to the future. And you have to work with the governments, to be able to get into their education system, because you have to try to catch these children early. You have to try to really push the agendas around, let's educate the girl child, let's educate children earlier on. And then when it comes to farming, you're talking about the issues of land. And I'm not too sure how many people are aware of that the issue of land on the continent is a hot topic all the time. Ownership of land in itself, the fact that our colonial history did not allow us to own land. And then when we got our independence, at some point, some people went rogue and decided we were taking land forcibly. This is farming land where, for example, Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of Africa, where we used to provide food for the continent as a small country. We have the best land, the best soils. But after what happened in the early 2000s, because of political lack of proper governance and the inability to work with the relevant partners to create an atmosphere where there's a transition where everybody wins, we started getting into spaces where people were just chopping trees willy-nilly. They're still doing that, burning out trees and land and saying they want to farm but don't know how to farm. And from the breadbasket of Africa, we suddenly became the basket case of Africa. And so this is all coming from governance. And you can see it that, right, there's just so many things you have to unpack. And you have to try to, the private sector is probably the key to it. But even with the private sector, you must know they have an axe hanging over their heads, because if they do not appease the governments and what's going on there, they could find in the morning, they could find their license revoked. And that happens really easily on the continent. You wake up one moment, you've got a license to run a school. Tomorrow morning, they'll be like, where did you get this license? We don't have you on our books. So it's a very interesting discussion. And I want people to be aware. I'm not saying it's hopeless. What I am saying is that we have to start somewhere. The conversation has to begin somewhere, and we have to acknowledge the challenges that we have and be able to find innovative solutions to deal with these challenges. Because right now, we're not preparing a future that we may live in. We're preparing a future that our grandchildren will live in. are we working towards this future, or are we just saying we're going to figure it out?
It's interesting because the moment you said education, I then linked it to what you were saying about accountability, because if you're educated, you have a better possibility of holding people accountable because you have better knowledge and you have better possibilities for making choices and well-informed choices. And then you come to why is it that it's so difficult to invest in education? It's exactly because there are powers in play who do not want this to actually happen, and to further that somebody is really going to come and say, hi, why are you not actually safeguarding our rights, and why are you not doing the best for us? So it's that's super fascinating to me. And as you say, it's just everything is so interlinked, because having worked on human rights issues for my entire life, it's also, I mean, it also goes back to simply registration at birth, because if you're not registered at birth, you don't legally exist, so you can't really claim your rights. And that's also something to take into consideration, that in many countries you don't necessarily get registered, so you don't even exist, which then in many cases, and for many specifically girls, it makes it easier to traffic you, to force you into marriage, because you have no voice, you are a non-entity. So there's so many facets.
Yeah, because I think of the systems that you have in the more developed countries. From the moment a child is born within the hospital, and healthcare is a key clog in this wheel, because hospital is where most things happen, where people are born and where people die. And this is in the most developed of countries. If you deny people healthcare, you are not registering births, neither are you registering deaths. And so people can be born in the rural areas, live their whole lives, no matter how long or short they are, and die without ever being registered on the government system. And even when you do a census check and you want to see how many people are in your country, how are you going to be able to tell how many people are in your country when you don't even know how many people are being born? They're doing the traditional head count. And there's a lot of migration between countries, people looking for work, people looking to survive. And so all of a sudden, you have that vacuum where you have even ghost voters during elections, which work in spaces where there's no accountability. And like I said before, accountability is what's really important. Even when people come to register for come to watch elections in whatever countries, is they're trying to make governments accountable. But we've seen that accountability only works when the people you are watching over or working with want to be accountable. Because we've seen all over the globe, politicians rigging elections blatantly. We have seen people denying the rightful winners the ability to govern blatantly. And we think that by waving and wagging our finger at them and saying, this is bad, don't do it, they're not going to do it. But we have seen that even the darlings of the international community one day, for example, what happened in Myanmar, can the next day become a whole different story. And it's simply because I think there's something within the human genome that believes that power is everything, and let's disregard people, lives, and progress.
It does seem that once you are in power and are really powerful, there is a slight hesitancy to accept and welcome accountability. I mean, let's put it that way. That's for sure. I wanted also to ask you, do you then see that the interest in, for instance, in family offices in investing sustainability, does that then also include an interest in how can we try to not necessarily not revolutionize, but slowly change systems also regarding accountability with our investments?
I think there is. But there's also that fear, like I said, when I was explaining to you the financial setup where you can get your accounts frozen and
Yeah.
money can disappear from the bank. You also realize that, especially with family office or wealthier families on the continent, um, a lot of them got their wealth from getting big deals. Big deals usually come from governments, and we all know that process can sometimes not be as democratic or as above board as we would like it to be. And so to a certain extent, then their money is controlled, what you do with it, because if somebody gave you something, they can take it away.
Yeah.
However, as I always say, it's we naturally are looking for the big movements. We're looking, so for example, when we think of philanthropy, we're thinking of the Gates Foundation has given so much billion to so and to such and such. And we applaud that and we think that this is going to make a change. But what I have seen is that within our communities, especially on the African continent, and I think I've shared with you the concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, we tend to exercise philanthropy in quite big figures that are not documented, because we're making the change in in the ways that we think are going to be most impactful. So you see the families that are family offices, families of wealth, or even family businesses that are not even at the point of being family offices, start making changes within their communities. They start digging up boreholes to create that ability to get water. They start creating colleges and education centers so that they can teach skills to people within their areas. They start building hospitals. They start building schools. They start taking ownership of the change that they want to see within their communities and growing that. It's not a huge, impactful, noise-making, thunderous change, but it is a slow, meaningful growth of a plant that came from an acorn that will one day become a big oak tree.
And it's change that makes sense to the people in the communities. It's also not something
Absolutely.
that's being imposed by somebody who got an idea from the outside.
Absolutely, absolutely. And even you will see that the businesses that these people create in Africa, we tend to create businesses that will provide sustenance within our communities. We want to employ the people within our communities to provide jobs, to provide food. We we have that sense of pride of being able to provide solutions. They might not always be loud solutions that everybody's saying, oh, we've managed to reach 5 million people, but collectively we probably reach more because it's something that's ingrained in us. We want to see the change. We want to see our countries prosper and our communities prosper. We might not be ready yet for that big governance change, because that's pressure coming from outside onto our governments for change. And when we try it ourselves, we find that we can become crippled, and even the small, significant changes we're making do not become as impactful as they could be.
Maria is asking, and I think it actually, to an extent, you just actually responded to this. Maria, do you want to take the floor?
No, she already answered. It's just about, again, the business elite, the small family offices, the multi-family offices, how they're engaged in this conversation. And from where you're talking, from what you just said, it's the development countries, just like Brazil. How can you be thinking about ESG if people don't have enough food to eat? So there is this big thing, and when you invest in education and health, it takes generations for you to see the result, generations and generations. So you go small steps. But from what you said, what would be the trigger to create the momentum? And I'm going back to the business elite, because you are working, you are specialized in the transfer of wealth to the next generation. How could that happen? And are you concerned or afraid, or would external pressure be a good push? How do you see that as well? External being international.
Okay, so I truly believe that change comes from within. When people see there's a need for something, they start creating resources to ensure that that need is met. And I think that's generally the story of humanity as we know it. We have created because there was a need for it. And so when you look at the African context of where we are in terms of evolution, we might be in a world that is looking at the fourth industrial revolution, but then we had a lot of our development was stopped midway, and we're trying to play catch up in not rushing to meet the fourth industrial revolution, but going at a pace that was stopped from where it stopped and trying to rebuild that, and then trying to also rebuild through the traumas that came with the disruption that happened. And so when you speak to the the businesses in Africa, there is research that was done once by, I think it's KPMG, or was it Price Waterhouse in Nigeria, where they found out only 2% of African businesses made it from founder to next gen. And that's a very small figure compared to the 30% on a global scale of founder to the next gen transition. And that in itself will tell you that there is a disconnect. There's something that's not happening, that's not allowing that transition from one generation to another. And let me tell you what happens when that transfer doesn't happen. It's like you are building a ship, and the father is got the vision of what he wants the ship to be, and he brings together all the resources and starts building this ship. And then as he's about to finish the ship and as he's being successful, he passes on. When he passes on, all his children decide, I want to be the next builder, because nobody told them that, you know what, this is the succession plan, or this is the vision that we all have to contribute to. So every child takes a bit of the ship and says, I'm going to build my own ship. So all of a sudden, all the work that's been made by the father to get the ship to almost completion is dismantled. And then each child has to start from scratch to build their own ship with their own vision. And then their children do the same thing, and it happens over and over and over again. So you don't get the momentum of the founder has taken the ship to this level. The succession plan brings in the next gen that comes in and adds on value to what has already been made, and you keep on growing it. And because of that, you find that it's a system that needs to be built on. It's a conversation that needs to be had. And to a lot of these family businesses on the continent, it's a new conversation, because there's cultural issues. There's also issues around tradition, also issues around some of the inherited things. Like if you find on the continent, Africa is recognized as a patriarchy-based continent, when in fact is a matriarchy-based continent. If you look at all the old kingdoms, all the conversations that ever happened on the continent, pre-colonialism, it's matriarchy. Colonialism came in, the West is more patriarch-based, brought the patriarchy conversation, and then forced it on Africans, and it became a patriarch conversation. And so you find that all those things that are still hanging in there, that are still not being recognized, that are still not being made to work better, are still affecting us. There are legal issues that still, like in countries on the continent, that still don't recognize women as adults. And I think recently in the last decade or 2 decades, I think the last decade was I, as a mother, allowed to go and get a passport for my child without the father's consent. Before, it was not possible. And so when you're looking at these families and you're looking at all the things that we want them to be able to pioneer and do, we need to look first at, have they managed to deal with their own issues and deal with their own cultural issues, traditional issues, and can they be relevant voices in a world that has moved so far and so fast? And how can you engage their next gens in a way where they won't go onto the boat and take their piece of the plank and want to rebuild another boat? You're on mute.
We have a question from Pamela. Pamela, do you want to post it or should I read it?
I can do, no problem. So Tsitsi, you said very nicely, it's like it's fundamentally about survival and kind of making a survival out of what is, in many cases, a dire situation to start with. At the same time, with the way the climate is shifting, Africa will be over proportionally affected in terms of the way the climate shifts and the geographies it affects, which will make that challenge even harder for many of the geographies. So that from an outside perspective, I would imagine that that would actually foster that sustainability discussion even more so, and not from an academic Western perspective, but from a very hands-on perspective from within. What's your take on that?
My take on it is that you're very right in saying that the conversation is going to have to start within. And one of the things that I've seen is that Africans do well is adapt. We adapt to pressure, we adapt to chaos, we adapt to whatever is there and make it successful. What is going to help us even more in the sense of this, as these changes occur, we need to be able to have more voices on the continent that are giving an example, creating awareness, and creating the solutions and working with the family businesses and the private sector into creating sustainable solutions for what's going on. And like you said, it's very right. Last week, Joburg had snow for the first time ever. It wasn't a lot of it, but it was enough to tell you that this has never happened before. And if it keeps on like this, we're not going to have enough winters that we're going to be able to survive in without central heating. And even the inability to create enough electricity for consumption on the continent. These are all issues that are there. And we need to start working with stakeholders. We need to start working with people who are innovative, who are going to be able to show us where the issues are and how we can fix it. But it's by no means an easy task, but it's happening at the right time, because you're now looking at a next gen like myself who is willing to say, you know what, yes, we have history. Yes, we've had bad governance, but yeah, we can complain all we want about it, but it's not going to bring a solution to the table. How do we fix what's going on the table?
On that note, do you see a number of people like you taking on this fight and gathering together and putting in place, like, what is it that we can do together? Do you feel that you are a lone voice, or that there is very much a community of like-minded people?
Absolutely not. I feel like there is a community of like-minded people. I feel there's a lot more people who are becoming aware, especially in the next gen. It's not a big demographic, because as always, you have that skew and scale in terms of poverty, the haves and the have-nots. The people like me are the people who had the advantage of having resources and being able to have access to resources. And it's now the responsibility for people like me to now communicate it to people who are the same age as me, who have never had the same resources, and trying to make them understand the urgency of what needs to be done and how we can collaborate to make it happen. It's not an easy task, because as we all know, the majority of the African continent is still within the rural areas, is still within those poverty, under those poverty lines, and trying to reach them on a level and saying, you know what, let's be sustainable. To them, they'll be saying, yeah, you can say that because you are a have.
Yeah.
I have not, so I am being sustainable anyway. And that argument they will just not take it. So it's finding ways of reaching them in ways that they will understand, because I live in the same societies as them. I understand the languages that they understand, and move them from conversations that they're being dragged into that are not helpful, but instead move them into conversations that are going to be helpful and beneficial to all of us.
Amazing. Any more questions from anybody?
And yes, Pamela, we will ski on Table Mountain.
Yes.
I'm first in, I'll join.
Well, if there are no other questions, I think I want to be mindful of the fact that you're sitting in the dark. But I personally really enjoyed this. I think it was amazing for me also to for once, it doesn't happen very often that we have this perspective. I speak with a lot of people who want to do good and who are, sitting in Zurich or in London and really have no real connection to the ground. So it was lovely to get that. I really enjoyed that very much. And I hope you might also consider coming back and speaking more about, for instance, your specific part of the continent, because here we really spoke about it more generally speaking, but we need to also be mindful that it's very different from one part to the other.
Absolutely. And I think the diplomatic communities say that Southern Africa is Africa light.
Yeah.
So yes. There is Africa extreme out there.
Exactly. And then you have North Africa, which is different in itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, completely.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much. I hope you will get light soon.
I hope so too. I hope so too, guys.
Thank you for all of you for being here and for in solidarity taking off your cameras. That was very good. I was thinking to do the same, but then at a certain point I was thinking, oh my god, then Tsitsi just looking at like blank screen of no reaction from anybody, and that's not nice either. So have a lovely evening, and I hope to see you here again really soon, and Tsitsi, we will be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.